The year was 1870, and the air in San Francisco was thick with the scent of ambition. Gold had already transformed California into a land of unimaginable wealth, but the hunger for new riches never faded. It was in this restless city that a rumor began to circulate. A whisper passed between cigar smoke-filled parlors and dimly lit saloons. Two mysterious prospectors, rough around the edges but carrying an air of quiet confidence, had reportedly made the discovery of a lifetime. They had returned from an undisclosed location deep in the American West, carrying something that made the most powerful financiers in the city lean in with interest. Philip Arnold and John Slack, an unlikely pair of Kentucky-born adventurers, walked into the offices of one of San Francisco's most prominent bankers, George D. Roberts. Their appearance was unremarkable: dusty clothes, sun-worn faces, but the bag they carried sent a jolt through the room. They placed it down on the banker's desk with deliberate care. Roberts leaned forward, hesitating only for a moment before untying the sack. What spilled out onto his desk nearly stopped his heart. Uncut diamonds, rubies, and sapphires glittering under the gaslights. The room fell silent. "Where did you find these?" Roberts finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Arnold and Slack exchanged a knowing glance before Arnold leaned in, his voice measured and firm. "Let's just say," he said slowly, "there's more where that came from." The air grew thick with tension. Roberts, a man known for his business acumen, studied them carefully. This wasn't the first time he'd heard wild claims, but this was something different. The gems were real. And if what these men were implying was true, he had just stumbled upon the greatest mining opportunity in American history. But Arnold and Slack weren't eager to share details. "It's too big to talk about in the open," Slack added, his voice barely above a murmur. "We're not fools. The moment people know, the land will be swarmed with miners." Robert sat back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk. If what they were saying was true, this was worth millions, maybe more. But he needed proof. "I need to know more," he said finally. "If you want serious investors, you'll have to prove that what you found is real." Arnold and Slack stood, their expressions unreadable. "You'll get your proof," Arnold said, "but this isn't for just anyone, only the right people." As the two men left the office, Roberts exhaled, staring at the pile of gems still scattered across his desk. If this was real, he had just been given access to a fortune beyond imagination. But if it wasn't, he shook his head, pushing the thought away. He had seen the gems with his own eyes, and in his world, seeing was believing. Little did he know, this was only the beginning. Word traveled fast. Within days, whispers of a secret diamond mine spread through San Francisco's elite circles. Bankers, investors, and railroad tycoons spoke in hushed tones, their curiosity piqued by the enigmatic pair who had walked into George D. Roberts' office with a fortune in raw gemstones. But no one knew exactly where the mine was, and that was the genius of it. Philip Arnold and John Slack were not eager sellers, nor were they desperate prospectors begging for funding. They played the part of cautious men who had stumbled upon something too valuable for just anyone to possess. Their reluctance to share details only deepened the intrigue. Roberts, eager to stake his claim, pressed them for more information. "Let's cut to the chase," he said, locking eyes with Arnold. "You say you found something big. You have my attention. But if I'm going to invest, I need to know where it is." Arnold leaned back in his chair, measuring his response. "We understand your position, Mr. Roberts, but understand ours. If we tell you where the mine is, what's to stop someone from moving in, stealing what we've worked so hard to find?" Roberts frowned. "You're asking me to trust you without proof." Slack chuckled under his breath. "We gave you proof," he said, gesturing toward the small velvet pouch of gems that still sat on Roberts' desk. The banker studied them carefully. The stones were undeniably real, their raw edges untouched by human hands. But something about this deal felt unusual. Before he could respond, Arnold leaned forward. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Roberts. If you had access to something this valuable, something that could make the richest men in America even richer. Would you just give it away? Silence. Roberts glanced at the gems once more, then exhaled. So what's your offer? Arnold and Slack exchanged a look before Arnold spoke. We're looking for the right partners, the kind of men who understand what's at stake, men who have the resources to protect an operation of this scale. Robert's mind raced. An opportunity like this was once in a lifetime. If what these men were saying was true, he couldn't afford to be left behind. But before he could say yes, Slack stood up, straightening his coat. We're not in a rush, he said, as if sensing Robert's desperation. We need to make sure we find the right people. And just like that, the two men turned and left, leaving behind a storm of speculation. That night, Roberts couldn't sleep. He knew what would happen next. The moment the city's wealthiest men heard about this, they'd demand a seat at the table. And if he hesitated for too long, he'd be left in the dust. By morning, his decision was made. He wasn't going to let this opportunity slip through his fingers. He would gather the most powerful investors in the country, and he would make sure Arnold and Slack had no choice but to let him in. By the time the sun rose over San Francisco, the city's most powerful men were already in motion. Banker George D. Roberts had wasted no time. He arranged a private gathering at the Pacific Union Club, the meeting ground for the richest and most influential figures in the West. The air inside was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the murmur of men who controlled railroads, banks, and entire industries. Seated around the table were titans of finance. William C. Ralston, the founder of the Bank of California, Asbury Harpending, a railroad mogul, and even Charles Louis Tiffany, the man behind Tiffany & Co., the most trusted name in gemstones. Robert stood before them, his voice steady. Gentlemen, I believe we have a rare opportunity before us. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small velvet pouch. With a flick of his wrist, he poured the contents onto the table. A dozen raw diamonds, rubies, and sapphires spilled across the polished wood. The room fell silent. The men leaned in, their eyes widening as the stones caught the light. Charles Tiffany picked up one of the gems, turning it between his fingers. After a long pause, he finally spoke. These are real, he said, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. The reaction was immediate. A quiet but unmistakable hunger filled the room. If Tiffany himself vouched for the gems, there was no question. They had stumbled upon something monumental. What's the catch? Ralston finally asked. Roberts hesitated. The prospectors, Arnold and Slack, are cautious. They're unwilling to reveal the exact location without securing the right investors. As they should be, Harpending muttered, nodding in approval. If this is as big as it seems, they need protection. A murmur of agreement swept the table. These were men who understood the dangers of gold rushes and land grabs. News of a diamond discovery would trigger a frenzy. Men would kill for a chance to stake a claim. Have they named a price? Ralston asked. Roberts exhaled. They're not selling outright, but they'll allow us to invest. We fund the expansion of the operation, and in return, we share in the spoils. The room went quiet. Then Harpending smirked. Well, he said, lifting his glass of bourbon, I don't see why we should let an opportunity like this go to waste. By the end of the evening, a coalition was formed. The richest men in America had just bought into what could be the biggest gold mine in history. All that was left now was proof, and Arnold and Slack were more than ready to provide it. The investors were hooked, but they weren't fools. Before committing their fortunes, they demanded to see the mine with their own eyes. Philip Arnold and John Slack were ready. We understand, Arnold said when Roberts relayed the request. But this isn't some walk-in and pick your diamonds operation. The terrain is dangerous. The location is remote. We can take a few men, but only a few. It was the perfect response. It made the mine sound even more exclusive. After some deliberation, a small group was chosen. Among them was Henry Janin, a respected mining engineer tasked with confirming the legitimacy of the find. With secrecy at its highest, the team departed San Francisco and traveled deep into the western frontier. The journey was long and grueling. Days passed as they ventured into the wild, crossing rivers and climbing jagged ridges. Finally, Arnold and Slack led them to a barren stretch of land in the Colorado Territory. "This is it," Arnold announced, stepping onto the rocky ground. The group exchanged uncertain glances. There was nothing remarkable about the landscape. But then came the moment that changed everything. Slack bent down, running his fingers through the dirt. With a practiced motion, he lifted a handful of soil, and among the pebbles, something glistened. A diamond, a sapphire, a ruby. The investors fell silent. Janine, the mining engineer, quickly joined in, digging his own hands into the dirt. More gems emerged. The deeper they searched, the more they found. The investors were stunned. The diamonds and rubies weren't in veins of rock, as in traditional mines, but instead were scattered freely in the soil, as if nature had been feeling generous. Janine, normally a skeptical man, could hardly believe what he was seeing. He studied the terrain, the minerals, and the gems themselves. By the end of the day, his verdict was clear. This is real. This might be one of the richest diamond deposits in history. The investors erupted in celebration. Arnold and Slack stood back, watching the frenzy unfold, keeping their expressions measured. They had just pulled off the greatest illusion of their lives. And now, the richest men in America were about to hand them everything they wanted. The return to San Francisco was triumphant. The investors, now drunk on the vision of limitless wealth, wasted no time in forming a powerful syndicate. Millions of dollars were pooled together, an amount unheard of for a single mining operation. Philip Arnold and John Slack were suddenly rubbing elbows with the most powerful men in the country. Overnight, they had gone from obscure prospectors to the gatekeepers of an empire. The syndicate moved quickly. They secured legal claims on vast stretches of land in the Colorado Territory, hired top engineers, and began assembling teams of miners. News of the secret diamond mine was kept under strict control. Only those at the top knew the full extent of what was at stake. To ensure the legitimacy of the operation, the investors sought an independent appraisal. And who better than Charles Tiffany, the legendary jeweler himself? The gems from the site were sent to Tiffany & Co. in New York. Tiffany examined them, unaware of their true origin. His verdict? A rough valuation of over $150,000, a staggering sum at the time. With Tiffany's approval, the investors now had everything they needed. A rich mine, a respected mining engineer's confirmation, and the endorsement of America's most famous jeweler. Arnold and Slack, however, were playing a different game. They continued to feign caution, keeping their distance from the syndicate's day-to-day operations. "We don't want full control," Arnold told Roberts, playing the role of a simple but protective prospector. "We just want our fair share." A fair share indeed. The pair quietly began cashing out, selling portions of their rights in the operation for hundreds of thousands of dollars. No one questioned it. Why would they? The mine was real. The diamonds were real. The richest men in America were about to become even richer. Or so they thought. The illusion was perfect, until the wrong man got involved. Word of the mysterious diamond mine had reached Clarence King, a renowned geologist and head of the U.S. Geological Survey. Unlike the eager investors, King was skeptical from the start. His instincts told him something wasn't right, and he intended to find out exactly what. Clarence King was not a man easily fooled. As the head of the U.S. Geological Survey, he had spent years studying the land, exposing fraudulent mining claims, and separating reality from fantasy. When he first heard whispers of a secret diamond mine in the Colorado Territory, alarm bells rang in his head. Nothing in his geological studies suggested that North America contained natural diamond fields of this magnitude. And so, without telling a soul, he set out on his own expedition. Guided only by second-hand accounts of the mine's location, King and his team made their way deep into the remote wilderness. They traveled for weeks, braving harsh conditions until they reached the fabled diamond field. What they found stunned them. The land was barren, unremarkable, just another patch of rocky soil in the vast American West. But then, as King sifted through the dirt, he spotted a glimmer, a diamond, then another, a sapphire. A ruby. At first, even he doubted his own instincts. Had he been wrong? Could this actually be one of the greatest discoveries in history? But then he looked closer. The stones were too perfect. Their placement, too random. It didn't make sense. Then a horrifying realization struck him. This was salted land. Someone had planted these gems here. Digging further, King made an even more damning discovery. The diamonds and rubies weren't native to North America at all. Some of the stones had even been cut and polished, clear evidence that they had been purchased, not mined. The entire mine was a fraud. King wasted no time. He rushed back to San Francisco and immediately alerted the investors. At first, they refused to believe him. How could they? They had seen the gems themselves. Charles Tiffany had confirmed their authenticity. A trusted mining engineer had vouched for the site. They had already poured millions into the project. But King was relentless. He presented his findings, his geological evidence, the undeniable proof that they had all been played. One by one, the investors' faces fell as reality set in. They had been scammed. And the worst part? Arnold and Slack were already gone. By the time the scheme unraveled, the two men had taken their money and disappeared. Philip Arnold returned to his hometown in Kentucky, where he quietly lived as a wealthy businessman. He avoided any serious legal consequences, settling out of court for a fraction of what he had stolen. He died years later of pneumonia after a gunfight with a rival banker. John Slack faded into obscurity, eventually working as an undertaker in New Mexico until his death. The investors, some of the richest men in America, were left humiliated. The Bank of California nearly collapsed from the financial blow. Charles Tiffany, whose appraisal had lent credibility to the scam, faced public embarrassment. As for Clarence King, he was hailed as the man who saved American finance from one of the greatest frauds in history. The Great Diamond Hoax of 1872 became a legendary cautionary tale, one that proved even the wealthiest, smartest, and most powerful men in America could be fooled. All it took was a handful of glittering lies.